Hi everyone, welcome to our Lord's Day Holy Reading. It's nice to have you here, and we're ready to get started.
All right, welcome everyone here in our community gathering and online. Glad you could join us for the 23rd week of Treatise of Self-Denial by Thomas Manton. And we're going to do, Lord willing, the third part of a three-parter. Originally said, I come now to speak to the second branch, submitting to the providence of God. We have done how far we are to submit to the will of God in providence. Number two, what are the grounds of this submission? Last week, and today the helps to it, which is going to be shorter than the other sections, but we have some excellent readings from Dr. Gill and Matthew Henry and one other anonymous source. And there's going to be some repetition here, but that's good for us. There's going to be talk about moderating our carnal desires and also murmuring, but there's a couple of newish ones. I don't think he's touched on them very directly. Anyway, so we've come to thirdly, for the helps by which we might bring our hearts to yield to the will of God. And a couple things came to my mind after reading this and looking it over several times over the last few days. It really struck me that when we think of His providence and His will, the Lord takes all the ambiguity out of the true believer's life, at least as far as the bottom line goes. Yeah, we're going to have ambiguity and obscurities in our lives as we live them day by day, the years. I mean, we all know how uncertain the world is. And so you think about it, the Lord takes all the ambiguity out of the true believer's life, and what a mercy that is, that the bottom line, you know that all things work for your good, and if we can only submit to that every time, it makes us live a whole lot more peaceful and confidently in the Lord. It's such a mercy, and if we choose to always rest in that reality, not easy at times, but I think it can be as you get older. Another thought is that occurred to me, why do professing Christians hold on to following their own wills? And if we're honest, to me anyway, isn't it largely to take refuge from God's will due to fearing His will, fear of losing control, of controlling our own destiny, which is sin. So that's something we need to avoid and move away from. And Mr. Manton is going to go right into that. See God in all things. This is number one. See God in all things, which pervades the rest of the message today. It's really that simple. This is the first principle of submission. Psalm 39 verse 10, quote, I was dumb and opened not my mouth because thou didst it. That made David quiet and altogether silent. So Hezekiah, as he's used many times, speaks of his patient submission to his disease and the sentence of death. Isaiah 38 verse 15, quote, what shall I say? He hath both spoken unto me and himself hath done it, unquote. That passage, though it be in the song of thanksgiving, relates not to the deliverance, but to the affliction. So here's the bottom line. As soon as we see God in the providence, which we know He is in everything, as soon as we see God in the providence, it is the duty of a Christian to cease and say no more. As he answered the king, I have learned not to dispute with him that can command legions. Why should we contend with the Lord of hosts unless we can make good our quarrel? Every wheel works according to the motion of the first mover, God. Creatures are but subordinate instruments of providence. We break our teeth, try to bite at the nearest link of the chain. Oh, look to the supreme mover. It is God that hath fastened all the links. David was so far from opposing God in this instance that he bears the very contumacy or stubbornness of the instrument, which was Shimei. David was so far from opposing God that it's from 2 Samuel 16, verse 11, quote, let him alone, David says, let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. It's the Lord's doing when people that bug us or anger us or try to anyway. This was spoken when Shimei cursed him, and one of the captains, if he could have, would have taken off his head. That was a time rather for humiliation, though, and revenge that David directed there. As a magistrate, he might have punished him, David might have punished him, but, quote, let him alone, saith he, I see God in it. Consider, it is God that chooseth men to be instruments of his justice, that by them he may admonish us of our duty. So anybody that comes along and you're not liking what they're saying to you or doing to you, that's God has divinely appointed you to that. To resist a lower officer of state is to contemn that authority with which he is armed. Consider, instruments are set a work by God. And I like this. They could not wag their tongue without God. It is good to see God at the end of causes. Do not think God sits idle in the heavens. Providence hath no vacancy. Christ saith, quote, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. God is always working in and by the operation of the creature. And I have a reading that my Father worketh hitherto, and I work is John 5:17, and Dr. Gill says, but Jesus answered them, saying, this is the verse, but Jesus answered them, saying, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Being convened before them and charged by them with the violation of the Sabbath, Jesus was, he vindicated himself in the following manner, saying, my Father worketh hitherto. He who is my Father, not by creation or adoption, but by nature, though he ended all his work on the seventh day and rested from what he had done, yet he did not cease from working at all, but has continued to work ever since, on Sabbath days, as well as on other days, in upholding and governing the world, in continuing the species of beings and all creatures in their being, in providing for them and in dispensing the bounties of his providence to them, in causing his sun to shine and showers of rain to descend on the earth, and in taking care of and protecting even the meanest of his creatures, and much more men, and still more of his own people. So it's a reminder of that. We sometimes probably have a picture of God sitting on his throne in heaven, not doing anything, but we know that he does, but it's just a reminder. And I work, or also I work, as the Syriac or Arabic version reads, in conjunction with him. Jesus works in conjunction with the Father as a co-efficient cause in the works of providence, in the government of the world, in upholding all things in it, in bearing up the pillars of the earth, in holding things together, and sustaining all creatures. Or I also work in imitation of him, in doing good both to the bodies and souls of men on the Sabbath day, being the Lord of it. I do but what my Father does, and therefore, as he is not to be blamed for his works on that day, he is. No. So Philo the Jew said, God never ceases to work, but as it is the property of fire to burn and of snow to cool, so of God to work. Thanks. So, when we look no higher than the creature, and so we're apt to murmur in that instance. Point 2, wait for changes. And as I read that, it came to me pretty quickly that wait for changes means be prepared. in life, prayerful, and this is what my thought here, prayerfully be on the lookout and alert for the ever-present vagaries of this life. We know, or should be ever mindful of, how uncertain this life is and the constant spiritual warfare we face. And so Mr. Manton is talking about that, basically. Evils foreseen are the better digested and borne. It is like the fitting of the burden before we put it upon our backs. So we're keeping watch over the world and our inner man, and there are Bible verses, obviously, about that. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit you like men, be strong. And I'm going to read, Lord willing, John Gill again on the part of this verse, 1 Corinthians 16, 13, his first long paragraph. Watch ye, the apostle, in the meanwhile, before he closes his epistle, thinks fit to give some proper and pertinent exhortations which might be of general use to this church, and first exhorts them to watchfulness, not for the coming of Apollos and a convenient season for that, but over themselves, over their hearts, thoughts, affections, words, actions, which what are you doing in your life, and their whole conversations, same thing, and over one another, that they go not into bad principles and evil practices, and also against sin in general, every appearance and the first motions of it, and particularly unbelief, and against Satan and his temptations, who is an indefatigable enemy, and whose wiles, devices, and stratagems are many and cunning, and against the world, its charms and snares, and likewise against false teachers who lie in wait to deceive, and therefore to be guarded against, many of which were among these Corinthians, and made this exhortation very necessary. It became them likewise to watch daily at wisdom's gates, to wait constantly upon God in the word and in ordinances, and especially to watch unto prayer, and in it, and after it. To all which it is necessary that they should be awake, and not asleep, to which the wise as well as foolish virgins are, that they should be sober and not be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and that they be in their proper station, on their watchtower where God has them, keeping a good lookout, and being ready armed to attack an enemy when descried. Many are the reasons why the saints should be upon their watch and guard, as because they have many eyes upon them. This is a good section here, finishing section. The eyes of the omniscient God are upon them, who sees and takes notice of all their actions. The eyes of angels are upon them, and even in their solemn assemblies. The eyes of saints are upon them, though watching for their good, and the eyes of evil men for their halting, and the eyes of devils are upon them, waiting an opportunity to do them hurt and mischief, if possible. Moreover, unwatchfulness exposes to many evils, temptations, and snares, to which may be added, as an inducement to watchfulness, the uncertainty of Christ's coming either at death or to judgment. Thanks. And some other verses that in that realm. Proverbs 6, verse 6, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Hebrews 11:7, by faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Romans 13, verses 11 through 14. Thought I would read all of that. What was that? 13, 11 through 14, right. And that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly, or decently, as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh, to fulfill the lusts thereof. Proverbs 23, verse 3, a prudent man foreseeth the evil, and hideth himself, but the simple pass on, and are punished. And finally, Matthew 25, verse 1, then shall the kingdom of heaven be likened unto 10 virgins, which took their lamps, and went forth to meet the bridegroom. And we know the rest of that one, most of us. Thanks. So, evils foreseen are the better digested and borne, and is like the fitting of the burden before we put it upon our backs. Hereby the cross is made more portable. The evil, quote, the evil I feared, saith Job, is come upon me, unquote. It is good to look for changes or to be prepared. It is good to look for the affliction before it finds us out, and to keep our mind and heart loose from all comforts. Not that you can't have comforts, but keep them loose. Keep your mind and heart loose. We have great reason to think of changes and being ready. We cannot elude the course which God hath set. The cause of suffering is born and bred up with us. We were born in sin, and sin grows as we grow, and therefore the cross, which is the consequent of sin, will not be taken away till we are taken out of the place of sinning. Totally. God might have translated this, us conjecturing, God might have translated us to heaven presently without trouble, but there is a method in all his works. He might have caused the earth to bring forth bread as well as an ear of corn out of nothing. But he would have it first to grow, then to be threshed, then ground, then baked, and so fitted for man's use. So along the same lines, there are many preparative changes to fit us for heaven. And there's a mystery there. These things that we're going through in this life prepare us for heaven. As the stones were squared before they were set in the temple, he were a madman that should expect his bread to grow out of the ground. The corn were cleansed by the flail, or bruised by the millstone, or baked in an oven, or should expect the stones of a building to come together by chance. So it is a great madness to think to go to heaven without changes and afflictions. We must expect to enter into the kingdom of God by much tribulation. And I have another reading by Dr. Gill. That's from Acts 14:22. The verse is confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. Acts 14:22, John Gill, confirming the souls of the disciples, not wicked men in their wickedness, nor righteous persons in an opinion of their own righteousness as sufficient for justification, both being contrary to the nature and tendency of the ministry of the word. The gospel being a doctrine according to godliness and a revelation of the righteousness of Christ, but the disciples and followers of Jesus, or whom he's talking here, whom they had already made in those places, these they confirmed in the doctrines of the gospel. And so these are the temporal challenges and adversities. And I'll stop there on that. The main part I wanted to read was, but their souls, confirming the souls of the disciples, but their souls, their more noble and valuable part, their hearts, which are apt to be unstable, the frames of their hearts, which are precarious, and so as not to be too much depressed, disagreeable, or be too much elated when agreeable, life in general, placing too much trust and confidence in them, and also the graces of the Spirit in their hearts as to act and exercise as faith, hope, and love, and likewise their judgments and understandings in the truths of the gospel, in what relates to the love of God, the covenant of grace, the person of Christ, and their interest in them, and exhorting them to continue in the faith, in the exercise of the grace of faith, and in the doctrine of faith, and in the profession of both, whatever they might meet with, on the account of all that thereof, in which they were to expect, and that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God, either into a gospel church state, like our church group here, which is sometimes there being much trouble often attending an entrance into that, as we well know, both from within, from the corruption and unbelief of the heart, and from without, from the temptations of Satan, and from the revilings and insults of men, even from friends and relations, or into the heavenly glory, which most people think about that. The way to that lying through many tribulations, and which, though rough, is a right way. So it, quote, must be necessary, partly on account of the decrees of God, who has appointed afflictions for his people, and them to afflictions, and partly on account of the predictions of Christ, who foretold his disciples that in the world they should have tribulation, as also that there might be a conformity to him, Christ, that as he, the head, must and did suffer many things and enter into his glory, so must they, his members, as well as likewise for the trial and exercise of the several graces of the Spirit. And here's that point again, and to make the saints meet for heaven, to make that the sweeter to them. So again, and I add a little thought here, the Lord has graciously made us aware of all these certainties. There are a litany of variables involved at arriving to meet these things. One way or another, the true believer will arrive at these destinations of testing. So point 3, moderate and lessen your carnal desires, which I think in our society we instantly think of things, material things, but it's also our inner man desires, spiritual desires. Our afflictions are very much heightened by our affections. We set up a court of providence in our own hearts. Mankind in general here does that. We set up a court of providence in our own hearts, enact laws there, and speak of what we would do and not do, and we set up a court of providence in our own hearts, enact laws there, and speak of what we would do and do not reserve the exceptions of God's providence. Oh, it is very hard to repeal the decrees and sentence of our own will when once it is set and determined. When we have decreed that thus we will do, this we will have, then we are vexed if God will not let it stand. So that can apply to us as Christians. This causeth storms and murmurs against the will of God. Jeremiah 45, verse 5, and seekest thou great things for thyself? Seek them not. When men's desires are for great things, especially in uncertain times, they do but dress up a trouble and sorrow for themselves. Again, Jeremiah 45. Let's see. 45 verse 5. Have a Matthew Henry, probably won't read all of it, but it's a good example of what Mr. Manton's talking about. Matthew Henry commentary on Jeremiah 45, and it's talking about Baruch. You probably remember it once I read it. The prophecy we have in this chapter concerns Baruch only, yet is intended for the support and encouragement of all the Lord's people that serve him faithfully and keep closely to him in times. It's how Baruch, it is placed here after the story of the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersion of the Jews, but was delivered long before, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. That was the prophecy in the next chapter, and probably those that follow. We find here, number 1, how Baruch was terrified when he was brought into trouble for writing and reading Jeremiah's roll. 2, how his fears were checked with a reproof for his great expectations, and silenced with a promise of special preservation. Though Baruch was only Jeremiah's scribe, yet this notice is taken of his frights, and this provision made for his comfort. For God despises not any of his servants, but graciously concerns himself for the meanest and weakest, for Baruch the scribe, as well as for Jeremiah the prophet. Baruch was employed in writing Jeremiah's prophecies and reading them, and how he was, and then we're talking about how he was for it by the king, warrants being out for him, and he forced to abscond, and how narrowly he escaped under a divine protection, to which story this chapter should have been subjoined, but that, having reference to a private person, it is here thrown into the latter end of the book, as St. Paul's epistle to Philemon is put after his other epistles. Observe 1, the consternation that poor Baruch was in when he was sought for by the king's messengers and obliged to hide his head, and the notice which God took of it. He cried out, "Woe is me now!" He was a young man setting out in the world. He was well affected to the things of God, and was willing to serve God and his prophet. But when it came to suffering, he was desirous to be excused. Being an ingenious man and a scholar, he stood fair for preferment. He thought he deserved better. And now to be driven into a corner and in danger of a prison, or worse, was a great disappointment to him. When he read the roll publicly, he had hoped to gain reputation by it, that it would make him to be taken notice of and employed. But when he found that instead of that, it exposed him to contempt and brought him into disgrace, he cried out, "I am undone. I shall fall into the pursuer's hand, and be imprisoned, and put to death or banished. The Lord has added grief to my sorrow, has loaded me with one trouble after another. After the grief of writing and reading the prophecies of my country's ruin, I have the sorrow of being treated as a criminal for so doing. And though another might make nothing of this, yet for my part I cannot bear it. It is a burden too heavy for me. I fainted in my sighing, or I am faint with my sighing. It just kills me. And I find no rest, no satisfaction in my own mind. I cannot compose myself as I should and would to bear it. Not have I any prospect of relief or comfort." So Matthew Henry, he says here, Baruch was a good man, but we must say this was his infirmity. Note 1, young beginners in religion, like freshwater soldiers, are apt to be discouraged with the little difficulties which they commonly meet with at first in the service of God. They do but run with the footmen, and it wearies them. They faint upon the very dawning of the day of adversity, and it is evidence that their strength is small, Proverbs 24:10, that their faith is weak, and that they are yet but babes, who cry for every hurt and every fright. And sometimes we have to remember that about young believers. 2, some of the best and dearest of God's saints and servants, storms rising, have been in frights and apt to make the worst of things, and to disquiet themselves with melancholy apprehensions more than there was cause for. 3, God takes notice of the frets and discontents of his people, and is displeased with them. Baruch should have rejoiced that he was counted worthy to suffer in such a good cause and with such good company, but instead of that he is vexed at it, and blames his lot, nay, and reflects upon his God, as if he had dealt hardly with him. What he said was spoken in a heat of passion, but God was offended, as he was with Moses, who paid dearly for that, when his spirit, being provoked, spoke unadvisedly with his lips. And thou didst say so and so, and it was not well said. God keeps account what we say, even when we speak in haste. So I'll stop there. So that was where he was talking about his carnal desires of importance and reputation, and he let that get, his infirmity in that area get away from him. Self-love and self-seeking always make way for self-trouble, and therefore keep your desires low. It is far easier to add than to subtract, and it is far better to rise with providence when God is ready for you to, when the master of the feast bids us, quote, bids us sit higher, unquote, than to be compelled after you've messed up in that area and to descend and lie in the dust. Therefore, till God's will be declared, it is good to keep the heart in an equal poise for all providences and not let our will outstart God's. As David said, 2 Samuel 15, verse 26, quote, if the Lord hath any pleasure in me, he will bring me back again. If not, here I am. Let him do with me what pleaseth him, unquote. He did not dare to pass his vote first, but gives providence the precedency. So should we. Point 4, consider what little cause you have to indulge your own murmuring. Guilt is not to any creature. Thou art a creature and a guilty creature, and God is the sovereign Lord of heaven and earth. Let this stop thy mouth. There is always cause from God in everything, and we may still say, as in Ezra 9, verse 13, quote, thou hast punished us less than our iniquities have deserved, unquote. We are now in Babylon, and we might have been in hell. Consider, God is too just to do us wrong. Certainly there is a cause. If he will exchange hell for Babylon, there is much of mercy, but nothing of injustice. But suppose there were no cause visible, which is probably most often, God may resolve the reason of his actions. He has a right to, into his own will. God is under no law, and thou hast no tie and engagement on him. Why should he give an account of his matters? If affliction is not deserved from men, like somebody's has no right to be berating you, let's say, over something, they're totally in the wrong. If that is not deserved from men, it is to be borne cheerfully, more cheerfully. Whose cross would we bear, the cross of Christ or the thieves? When we suffer as malefactors, we bear the thieves' cross. There is no cause why we should allow our murmuring. Consider the evil of murmuring. Search it to the head, and you will find it always comes from pride. The devil is the proudest creature and the most discontented with his condition. Murmuring is always a fruit of supposed merit. We think we have deserved better. Alas, we are worthy of nothing, and if we have ever so little, we have cause enough to be content. Though you cannot fare as others, though you have not such good trading, though you have not houses so well furnished, yet what have you deserved? Point 5, do but interpret your murmuring. What is it? It is but a taxing of God, which means a burdening of God. It is but a burdening of God, and it is an high presumption for creatures to tax their Creator as if they were wiser than he. It is, in effect, to say, this is not well done, God. There is an error in providence. We need to correct it. If it be good and best, why should we repine? And 6, consider, what little good will murmuring do us? We should never argue against providence, because we cannot counterwork it. It is best to do that voluntarily which we must otherwise do by force. Submit to God. God will have the better in all contests with the creature. Job 9, verse 22, quote, hinder him, quote. Your comforts and children and estates are in his hands. If he will take them away, who can hinder him? Therefore, why should we murmur against him? And that's it for today. Lord willing, next week we will enter into the next section. I will read the introduction. The next branch of self-denial is denying self-love. God is the chiefest good and highest object of the creature's respect, and therefore we are to deny self, that is, self-love. A necessary doctrine. It is said, quote, in the latter times that men should be lovers of themselves, 2 Timothy 3, Verse 1, men have always been lovers of themselves in every age of the church, but in the lees and dregs of time, as time moves on, this evil shall most reign and prevail. The latter times are inflamed with wars, and so all love to our neighbor is devoured, and with heresies, and so God is neglected, and then there remains nothing but self to be respected and adored. In the abbreviation of divinity, or in a moral consideration, there are made to be but three general persons or beings: God, thy neighbor, and thyself. Now when men have lost their reverence to God and their charity to their neighbor, self is only left to devour all the respect of the creature. So meditate on that, and please look into everything Mr. Manton and the others have talked about today. Glad you could join us, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Amen. Thank the Lord. And yes, everyone on the line, glad you could join us and go in God's graces. And Lord willing, we'll talk to you again soon.